Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So we are on the final meeting of Hadith criticism. Two perspectives covered in the last two meetings, one on Mu'tazila and the second one on Hanafi. So you have all slides on both. So, and today we are on the final with Jumhur. So mostly when people hear about Hadith criticism, they expect to speak about this subject exactly, about Jumhur and about Shafi'i, and then about what we have right now on in the books of Muṣṭalaḥ. So I'll cover three points here. I'll speak about references, history, and criteria. So for references, this a narrow list. I mentioned some of these in the beginning, but these especially on Jumhur. So just I want to mention something before going over everything. Today we should finish at 8:10. So we have around 55 minutes to cover everything. So I hope I can cover everything here. So for references on Jumhur perspective, that start from Shafi al-Risala, and then three early treatises by Muslim, Muqaddima, and then Abu Dawud Risala ila Ahl Makkah, At-Tirmidhi al-Ilal, and its commentary by Ibn Rajab. And then and a work from the 4th Islamic century, Al-Kamil by Ibn Adi, is a huge work by Ibn Adi on Rijal in the Dar Kutub al-Ilmiya edition, 9 volumes. In the 4th Islamic century and the 5th Islamic century, two major works, one by Al-Naysaburi. He has 3 works, Al-Ma'rifa, Al-Madkhal, and also Al-Mustadrak ala al-Sahihain. And then all Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi works, Ibn al-Salah al-Muqaddima, Ibn Daqiq al-Eid al-Iqtirah, then Ibn Hajar Nuzhat al-Nazar, Sharh Nukhbat al-Fikr, Al-Suyuti Tadrib al-Rawi, and then contemporary works, major works by Nuruddin Atar, Mustafa al-Azami, and Hatim al-Auni. And also there is an article, essay will be published very soon, inshallah, with Oxford Hadith Handbook. This towards the systematization of the science of authentication and Hadith classification, authors and their works. This from Shafi'i till Al-Albani. So, however, in this meeting, I'm going to cover what I mentioned partially in this article. So, as I mentioned in the beginning of our meetings, I divided the history of Ilm al-Istilah into 3 major periods. The first one, Mutaqaddimin, early, and then late, Mutaakhirin, and then Mu'asirin, contemporary. So in the early period, we can witness 2 different disciplines or 2 different issues. The first one is the question of authenticity, and then the terminology. So these 2 things addressed in Ilm al-Hadith and Ilm al-Muṣṭalaḥ. But however, so I'll speak about both of these and which one and where, which one and when started and with which scholar. And different approaches also. I mentioned that in the beginning of our meetings, there are different approaches to divide the history of Ilm al-Istilah into 6 or 7 or 4 periods. And as I said, to understand the methodological and theoretical background of the ilm, it seems for me it's very easy to divide into 3 periods, major periods. Mutaqaddimin, and this from inside the discipline, how the ulama presented and introduced the ilm. They said something about mutaqaddimin and then mutaakhirin, and I added mu'asirin because we witness a new phenomena in this time. So Ibn Hajar and the Suyuti, both of them were interested in presenting and explaining the history of ilm. So in Ibn Hajar's Nuzhat al-Nazar, in the introduction, he stated that Al-Ramah-Hurmuzi is the first book penned on ilm al-Muṣṭalaḥ, the book al-Muhaddith al-Fasil bayna al-Rawi wal-Wa'i. But this book by Al-Ramah-Hurmuzi, as Ibn Hajar said, was not comprehensive. لكنه لم يستوعب. So Ibn Hajar said, this is the first book in ilm, in this discipline, but still the book not comprehensive. لكنه لم يستوعب. So when we read the content and check the content of Muhaddith al-Fasil, Muhaddith al-Fasil, this is what we find. So the content mostly about the method of hearing and receiving hadith and the manner of relating hadith and the stipulation regarding their transmission rather than hadith terminology. So the image of ilm al-Muṣṭalaḥ, as we see right now from al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and then Ibn al-Salah, Ibn Hajar, we cannot trace all of this information in al-Muhaddith al-Fasil. So we don't see the transmission or the transition, I'm sorry, from al-Muhaddith al-Fasil to al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. So then if we go to al-Khatib al-Baghdadi just like 1 century after al-Ramah-Hurmuzi, we see al-Khatib al-Baghdadi relied on al-Ramah-Hurmuzi for his book on the manner and stipulation of relating hadith. I mean, al-Jami' li akhlaq al-Rawi wa adab al-Sami', not in his book al-Kifaya. Al-Kifaya mainly and mostly about hadith terminology and hadith criticism. So we see that al-Khatib al-Baghdadi quoting al-Ramah-Hurmuzi in al-Jami' li akhlaq al-Rawi wa adab al-Sami'. And I mentioned al-Jami' li akhlaq al-Rawi wa adab al-Sami' on Mu'tazila perspective when I relate this book to Qabul al-Akhbar wa Ma'rifat al-Rijal, 2 images of Ahl al-Hadith. One, a bad image by al-Balkhi, and then a good image by al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. If we check the title of al-Ramah-Hurmuzi, the very title of al-Ramah-Hurmuzi book is to distinguish between the transmitter, al-Rawi, who merely transmits and between a knowledgeable transmitter, al-Rawi al-Wa'i. So the book, the title, al-Muhaddith al-Fasil, dividing line between al-Rawi, just merely transmits, and al-Wa'i. So that's between al-Muhaddith and al-Faqih. So I just look and I found that Ibn Hajar restated what he said in Al-Nuzha. In his book Al-Mu'jam, Al-Majma' Al-Mu'assis lil-Mu'jam Al-Mufahris, this Thabat for his shuyukh, he said is the Al-Muhaddith Al-Fasil is most likely the first book that had been compiled in Ulum al-Hadith, even though it was preceded by singular treatises on different matters of the discipline, but Al-Muhaddith is more comprehensive than preceding ones in al-Ramah-Hurmuzi time. Later Hadith scholars expanded in that. So however, this I think this from Ibn Hajar to restate what he said in Nuzha. So here to consider there are some treatises came and preceded Al-Muhaddith al-Fasil, and what he means here is to speak about what's coming later about al-Ilal and Muqaddimat al-Imam Muslim and Risalat Abi Dawood ila Ahl Makkah. So So we have two things in the history of this discipline. The first one, the question of authenticity, and then the terminology. So for the first one, the question of authenticity, the first work on this question was Al-Shafi'i Al-Risala. And for terminology, I think the first work should be considered Al-Hakim Al-Naysaburi Al-Ma'rifa. And this is the second book in Nuzha after Al-Muhaddis Al-Fasil. So if we speak about the genre as Hadith terminology, we cannot consider Al-Muhaddis Al-Fasil the first one as comprehensive work. The comprehensive work should be considered the second book in Nuzha's list as a comprehensive, but not the, if we speak about the genealogy of all of these comprehensive works, we should go to the third Islamic century, as I'll speak later. And then I'll go back to Shafi'i Risala on the question of authenticity. So then the early treatises by Abi Dawood, At-Tirmidhi, and Muslim, these are the original but personal. What I mean personal and incomplete, just these treatises used as introduction for their books. So it's not to understand the genre, the discipline, but these treatises is to understand what's the method and what's the criterion that Al-Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, and Muslim followed in their books, Sunan Abi Dawood, Sunan At-Tirmidhi, Al-Jami', and Sahih Muslim. And also incomplete. So they covered few concepts, few terms, like Al-Mashhur in Sunan Risalat Abi Dawood ila Ahl Makkah, the term Hasan in Al-Ilal, and in Muqaddimat Muslim Al-Munkar. There are few terms covered in all in these treatises. And also for the original works, we should not forget the books on Jarh and Ta'dil, Su'alat, and Ilal. All of these started in the third Islamic century and so on. These books are very important to understand the background, the context, and the history of ideas. So both in Mu'tazila works and these books are very important to understand. There are many technical terms used without a context. So when we read Kitab al-Kamil by Ibn Adi, we can trace and track some ideas, the concept of Rafa, the concept of Thiqa, the concept of Sariqat al-Hadith, and all of these issues, as I said in Kutub al-Mu'tazila, when we speak about the history of ideas and the concept of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah and Sawad al-A'zam in these books. So the first statement on the Sahih concept, this by Shafi'i in his Risala, it's better to read this statement, is a long statement by word, because it's very important to see how the definition of Sahih after 4 centuries after Shafi'i, this statement encapsulated in one line. So here Shafi'i said, someone said to me, define for me the least authoritative hujjah. Here's the issue of authenticity. Kind of text that binds scholars, who must then acknowledge that such reports, khabar al-khassa, he considered the least authoritative khabar al-khassa. In his book, Jima' al-Alam, he divided khabar in two categories. The first one, khabar al-amma, and khabar al-khassa. And this is different from mutawatir and khabar al-ahad. So however, there are many definitions and explaining that khabar al-amma is mutawatir. I don't agree with this. I see khabar al-khassa covered khabar al-ahad and khabar al-mutawatir. And khabar al-amma is something related to ijma', is bigger than reports. So khabar al-khassa has become conferred for them. I said it's khabar al-wahid of an individual from and individuals that reach all the way back to the Prophet or back to someone just short of him. The authority of such a report is not, however, established until several things are in place. 5. And you see here the number in different orders: 3, 2, 4, 5, 1. So just based on your knowledge after reading, just let me know why we have these different orders. So the person who transmits the Khabar al-Wahid must be the first one trustworthy in his religion, ثقة في دينه, known for veracity in his hadith reports, معروفا بالصدق في حديثه, able to understand what he is transmitting, and acknowledgeable about how different wording can result in distortion of the meaning. He must be someone who repeats a hadith report literally, just as he heard it, and doesn't paraphrase it. If, on the other hand, he conveys it literally, then there is no possibility that might cause one to fear that hadith distortion. So here to speak, this is a very important statement to connect riwaya بالمعنى to adala, not to dabt. So here what we have like later on, so the idea of riwaya بالمعنى mostly coming under dabt, but here under adala. So because if you change the meaning, if you change the words of the, this is not about hifz, it's not about memory. It's about distortion, it's about distorting and changing the meaning. And this very important shift from dabat to, or from adala to dabat in the coming centuries. The second shart, he must be a good memorized hafizan if he transmits from memory, and someone who preserves his notes carefully if he transmits from his notes. The third shart, if he has the same hadith as persons who transmit from memory, then his hadith report must agree with theirs. The fourth one, he must also be innocent of concealing defect, بريئا من أن يكون مدلسا, in transmission, that is, of transmitting things from people whom he met but from whom he did not actually hear anything, or transmitting things from the Prophet that contradict what trustworthy persons transmit. And the last one, everyone above him who transmits must be so all the way up given hadith report chain of transmitters until it reaches the Prophet or whomever else it reaches short of him. This is because each one of them authenticates it for the subsequent transmitter and provides authentication of the preceding transmitter. None of them can be without the characteristics that I have just listed. This is a translation by Joseph Lurie on a Risala. So just back to my question, why we have different orders. So what these points and these numbers indicate to? Right. So the second one is the second shart in Ibn al-Salah. And the third one is the third one in Ibn al-Salah. And then fourth, and then 5 and 1. So the second one is dabat. And the third one is hifz, dabat. I'm sorry, the first one adala. The second one dabat. And the fourth one shuduz, illa, and then ittisal. So you can see this statement is very big in Shafi'i al-Risala, and then encapsulated step by step, and then to be one line in Ibn al-Salah muqaddimah. So then here we can see two levels of dabat. So the first level sahih, and then sahih shadh. So we have two ways to examine the dabt of any narrator. The first one is just based on his mentally capacity. Is someone can deliver sound message and without any problem, and then we can say this ضابط. And then to compare this narrator with other narrators, and here then to judge based on this this examination that this person is still ضابط or has shuzuz. So then there is a very important question. So can we consider any hadith shadh sahih or any sahih shadh? So the idea here, if there is a narrator and has a sound hadith, good mentality, and he gives everything right, and he passed the exam of muhaddithin in adala and dabt and everything and ittisal, and he deliver a text. This is the first Islamic century and the second Islamic century. And after combining all texts, we find this text contradict with other texts. So based on the first examination, we should say sahih. And then on the second step, this coming to be shadh. So then this just for, and this very technical term is not about shuzuz in general, a very technical term. So then we can consider some akhbar, some ahadith in kutub al-sihah, ahadith sahiha and shadha. Why? Because these akhbar, these ahadith contradict with others. So this is a very technical term. So this hadith sahih, like just based on muhaddithin, but not applicable. So we cannot rely on in amal. So for shuzuz, there are three definitions. The first one by Ash-Shafi'i. So no one found this definition in any books of Ash-Shafi'i, Al-Umm, Al-Risala, or Jima' al-Ilm. So Ibn Muṣṭalaḥ narrated the definition through Yunus bin Abdul A'la, the student of Ash-Shafi'i. And Ash-Shafi'i in this definition said two factors, two elements should be existent to consider any hadith shadh. The first one tafarrud, and the second one mukhalafa. So if any narrators narrate any reports and no one narrates the same report, and then it found the same report contradict with others. And this in the second Islamic century. After 2 centuries, by Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, he just limited this definition to one factor, one element, just tafarrud, and tafarrud by thiqa. And Al-Khalili, just after Al-Hakim in the same century, he said tafarrud by tafarrud al-shaykh. Is not thiqa, could be thiqa and couldn't be thiqa. So either. So then the idea of shadh in the second Islamic century about 2 factors and then becoming just 1 factor. So many commentaries, comments, and explanations written on these definitions. For me, I think it's obvious because the first 3 Islamic centuries is not just about transmitting, it's about fiqh and transmitting. So mukhalafa is very important here. And then after, in the 4th Islamic century, we can find in the introductions of many works by Ibn Hibban, Al-Khattabi, and others, lamenting the division into Muslim community in 2 camps, the people of riwayah and the people of dirayah. And then the people of riwayah just narrating ahadith mutafarridina biha. So we don't found all of these ahadith in the first 3 Islamic centuries. So if anyone in the 4th Islamic century came with one like a hadith, no one narrates that, this is a sign for ulama in the 4th Islamic century to consider this shuzuz. That's different from Ash-Shafi'i. And this is what I suggest in the book Manhaj Qabul al-Akhbar, is about the context, it's not about the difference in definitions. So just to mention early works, this before Al-Rama Hormuzi and in the century of Al-Rama Hormuzi, 3 treatises I mentioned before, previously, Muslim Muqaddimah, Abu Dawud, Risala ila Ahl Makkah, At-Tirmidhi, and 5 works in the 4th Islamic century, Ibn Abi Hatim al-Razi, Taqdimah al-Ma'rifah li Kitab al-Jarh wa al-Ta'dil. This is a very important work to understand the 8 levels of narrators. 4 levels to accepted narrators and 4 levels for unaccepted narrators. These 8 levels becoming later with Ibn Hajar 12 levels. And to understand all of these levels, to understand the ranks of Hasan, Sahih, Da'if, we need to understand all of these ranks. So we cannot understand Sahih, Hasan, Da'if without understanding all of these ranks. It's coming together as a package. So everything, when we go to the earlier sources and Mutaqaddimin, we need to combine Al-Razi 8 levels with the concept of Sahih, Hasan, Da'if. When we go to Ibn Hajar, we need to compare 12 levels with 3 ranks of, or 5 ranks. I'll mention Sahih li-ghayrihi, Sahih li-dhatihi. And also Ibn Hibban, introduction to his book Sahih, in his introduction, he said something very important. أصل الأخبار كلها آحاد. The origin of all reports, ahad. And this is a very important statement in the 4th Islamic century. And then Al-Ramah book, Al-Muhaddis Al-Fasil, I just mentioned this book, and Ibn Adi, not Ibn Uday, this before correcting by Maulana Bilal, Al-Kamil fi al-Du'afa. And I said this is a very important book to focus on the background, the context of Tasheeh, Tahseen, and narrators. And then Al-Khattabi, introduction to Sunan Abi Dawood, Ma'alim as-Sunan. In this book, also 10 pages introduction to give an image about the 4th Islamic century divided in two camps, Ahlul Diraya and Ahl al-Riwaya. So 7 rules, I call this like 7 rules of Muslim Muqaddimah. So just this slide, maybe you can read later. I summarize Muqaddimah in 7 rules. And then you can find all of these rules in later works. So, in the concept, there is a new debate right now that like Salafi or some modern scholars use the term of illah to give tasheeh and tahseen. And this discussion between Salafi and traditionalists is the sources for tahseen and tasheeh and tad'if is just the books on narrators, or to go deeply with ilal. And with ilal, it seems here we have something beyond narrators. How and in which way each narrator, each transmitter narrated hadith. So the first one who established the concept of illah is Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, as Ibn Rajab said in his Sharh al-Ilal. So described by Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali as the first hadith critic who opens the door wide to the criticism of hadith narrators, and for knowing whether the chains of isnad are connected or unconnected, and for unearthing the atomic details of ilm al-ilal. So, but illah concept has 2 different images in mutaqaddimin and mutaakhirin. In mutaqaddimin, so just to lie considered illah, and abrogation is illah. So any obvious or hidden reason considered illah. So they consider inqita', also disconnection, and isnad, this illah. But for mutaakhirin, we cannot say that there is illah in hadith except if it should be hidden, not apparent or clear, obvious. And also with Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, we see that the first statement by Ibn Daqiq al-Eid that there are 2 types of ilal. So ilal of muhaddith scholars and ilal of fuqaha. And this very clearly we found it in Kutub al-Hanafiya, so Hanafi Usuli books. So for Hanafi Usuli books, ilal is just about matan, is not about isnad. And for muhaddithin, ilal just about isnad, is not about matan. And this is very important to understand when we see ilal in usuli books in the chapter on akhbar, and ilal in muhaddis books in the chapter of in sahih definition. So from beginning with Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi al-Ma'rifa, so he started with the definition of Sahih. So it seems like in that century, the discipline started to be shaped and introduced beginning with Sahih concept, not with Mutawatir or Yaqeen and Dhann. The concept of Sahih. And then from Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, we traced all works from Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, the 4th Islamic century and 5th Islamic century, till the 9th Islamic century, till Ibn Hajar, the Ilm al-Hadith introduced by Sahih. Till Ibn Hajar, the discipline introduced in a different way, based on Maqbul, and then the ranks of Ilm. Yaqeen and Dhann and Daruri and Nadari. So this and same. So before Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, as I said, we have scattered and we don't have a complete work. We have Muhaddis Fasil, but not on Hadith terminology. And Al-Risala, I consider this book on Hadith, on Ilm al-Hadith, more than Usul al-Fiqh. And I think Pakistani edition, they put something on the title on a Risala, if I recall. While Hallaq said something on the title of a Risala in the Pakistan, they add something like a Sunnah or al Hadith. I need to check with this. So the evolution of Hadith and narrators, as I said, for narrators we have two major rankings. The first one, 8 by Ibn Abi Hatim al-Razi in his Al-Ma'rifa fi Kitab al-Jarh wa al-Ta'dil, and then with Ibn Hajar, 12 ranks. So 8, 4 accepted, 4 unaccepted, 12, 6 accepted, and 6 unaccepted. So the last in 4s, the last one is a rank for i'tibar, is a rank of narrator to be supported. So this maratibul i'tibar. And also the two ranks of the last two ranks of 12 of accepted narrator, also maratibul i'tibar, is these narrators accepted based on mutaba'at and shawahid, based on supporting ahadith. And for hadith, we can observe 3 major shifts. The first one, 2, that's pre-Tirmidhi, binary division, sahih and da'if. And then with Tirmidhi in ilal, we see 3 categories. The first one, sahih, hasan, and da'if. And then with Ibn Hajar, the 3 becoming 5. So Sahih divided in 2, Sahih لذاته, Sahih لغيره, Hasan, Hasan لذاته, Hasan لغيره, and Da'if. So another shape or image of evolution, the shift from naw' to muṣṭalaḥ. So in Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, all titles was naw' types. But types here and naw' is not equal to muṣṭalaḥ. So under naw' 18 includes a couple of terms. So we see maybe 10 terms, 10 muṣṭalaḥ under types. So for Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, he mentioned 52 naw'. And then by Ibn al-Salah, these 52 coming 65. And then with Al-Bulqini, the 65 becoming 70. And then with the Suyuti becoming 100. And still Ibn Hajar and then Ilm al-Hadith introduced in a different way, not based on naw'. So the naw' here is different from term. And for Ibn Salah significance, I found these 4 points significant to understand the shift with Ibn Salah. The first one, the definition of Sahih, comes to be crystallized. So the long text by Shafi'i encapsulated without any change in the content, in one line in Muqaddimah. And the second point on the anomalous, the Shadh Hadith type, Ibn Salah presented all 3 opinions, Shafi'i, Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, and Al-Khalili. Then he judged each one without selecting one definition for Shadh. For him, Shadh based on a Shafi'i definition should be rejected, since it combined tafarrud and mukhalafa. And according to 2 other definitions, which means an isolated hadith, just fard or tafarrud here, it has 2 levels. Rejected if it's transmitted by a weak transmitter, and this mostly based on Al-Khalili. Accepted if it's coming through a reliable transmitter. This based on Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi. And then 2 things noticed in relation to mutawatir report. First, Ibn Salah confessed that mutawatir reports are very rare, and second, he also confessed that mutawatir is not a hadith term and doesn't belong to the discipline. And just followed Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, because the same statement by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi in Al-Kifaya that mutawatir doesn't belong to the discipline. But then with Ibn Hajar, he include mutawatir in his book as a term in the ilm. Also in Muqaddimah, we see another shift taking place in the concept of Hasan. After surveying the usages and definitions of Hasan in the early hadith works, Ibn Salah divides Hasan into 2 subcategories. The first concerned a Tirmidhi definition, and second concerned Al-Khattabi. So Al-Hasan here is still undefined with Ibn Salah. So if you go to Ibn Salah and study Muqaddimah, so you see Sahih is very clear, Da'if very clear, but Hasan, there's no any concrete or fixed definition for Hasan. So undefined, as a majority of hadith terms defined in Ibn Salah Muqaddimah. So there are a couple of terms in Muqaddimah still undefined. One of them Al-Hasan, other Al-Mursal Al-Khafi, and so on. So from Ibn Salah to Ibn Hajar, there are some works on Muqaddimah, this like 2 Islamic centuries, mostly to like the idea of nazm, versifying or epitomizing or supplementing or abridging. So for the first one is just nazm, there are two major works. The first one At-Tabsira wa Tazkira, or Alfiyat al-Iraqi, it's by Iraqi, and there are 3 major commentaries on Alfiyat al-Iraqi, one by al-Sakhawi, Fath al-Mughis, and another one by al-Iraqi, Fath al-Mughis, and the third one by Zakaria al-Ansari, and the second major work, Al-Hidayah fi Ilm al-Riwaya, by Ibn al-Jazri, and its commentary by al-Sakhawi, Al-Ghaya fi Sharh al-Hidayah. And for ikhtisar, there are 4 major works. The first one, Irshad Tullab al-Haqa'iq lil-Nawawi. All of these works mentioned in the towards the systematization of hadith science. So the 2 Islamic centuries without adding to the ilm, just few concepts and a few issues, explaining very few issues. So going to Ibn Hajar, Nukhbat al-Fikr, 3 points, 3 major issues notice. The first one, Ibn Hajar preserved Ibn Salah definition of Sahih without any change. Yet he went back to a Shafi'i definition of Hadith Shadh and set it as an official definition. So here backing to a Shafi'i. And here without any context. So not because Ibn Hajar in his time, there are the time of fiqh. But just back to the first definition by Shafi'i, tafarrud and shuzuz, and following the first one. So then here we consider al-Hakim and al-Khalili just a definition with a context, just in the 4th Islamic century. In this method, Ibn Hajar revives the core conditions of early hadith authentication made by Shafi'i. The second point, setting a clear definition of Hasan. In this definition, Hasan, similar to Sahih definition, except the third shart dabit. So then complete dabat or incomplete dabat. Complete dabat is Sahih and incomplete dabat is Hasan. And this followed by Mu'asirin and all scholars after Ibn Hajar. And then new 5 subcategories of hadith emerged with Nukhba: Sahih لذاته, Sahih لغيره, Hasan لذاته, Hasan لغيره, and Da'if. And these are very, very important for contemporary scholars, because with these 5 categories, there is a very big room for tasheeh and tada'if. So after studying the discipline and understanding the idea of mutaba'ah and understanding the 12 ranks of narrators, if you study any hadith, and you can go between these 2 ranks, Sahih لغيره and Hasan لغيره. If you avoid Hasan لذاته and Sahih لذاته, you can avoid these and you go in this gray area, Sahih لغيره and Hasan لغيره. And Da'if, it's also a very fixed area. So for that, there are many engaged in this ilm, and this is a very big room to our contemporary scholars to judge. So then if anyone says Sahih, this very tricky when say Sahih. But Sahih لغيره, okay, there is a room for this. And Hasan لغيره, there is a room based on mutaba'at and supporting akhbar. So to the last one, contemporary hadith terminology, we finished with mutaqaddimin and then mutaakhirin, and right now with contemporary mu'asirin. 3 phenomena noticed here: the emergence of orientalism in the discipline and orientalist writing on hadith criticism, and the second one, emergence of academic institutions. So hadith, Muṣṭalaḥ hadith, studied and addressed in academic institutions with modern textbooks, not to read a Tadrib al-Rawi or Muqaddimah. And the third one, more focusing on the content, matan criticism. So we found that many scholars engage with defending that ulama did matan criticism. And this, for me, it's a very weak viewpoint, because the entrance and the main approach, the main criterion for ilm al-hadith is adala, is about rijal, is not about matan. And this is the mutaqaddimin. We need to understand this, very important. And when you reject any hadith, criticize any hadith, you reject isnad, not reject matan. You reject this isnad. And this is different from Hanafi, different from Mu'tazili, and different from Orientalist, and different from modern perspective. So for hadith is very objective, is just to transmit this isnad. So if anyone, any like كذاب, narrate a mutawatir hadith, من كذب علي متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده من النار, this is not considered موضوع. So not matan. But based on others, so if any narrator has any problem and transmitted any matan with a problem, if this matan rejected, all matan connected with the same meaning rejected. And this is very important to understand the main perspective of hadith scholars. And for me, this is more objective than the second one. Yes, there is subjective, because when we accept this narrator, we accept everything from him, even though this he narrates something against our madhab. So then there are 2 criteria. The first one, naqd based on adala, and the second one, ra'i different from riwayah. To see, is this narrator is not to narrate, and to narrate not to see. Ra'i and rawa, ra'a and rawa. So ra'a, hamza, and rawa with waw. So when you go to ra'i, when you go to opinion, that doesn't mean to narrate the same akhbar. And if you narrate some akhbar, that doesn't mean that you see or your opinion based on these akhbar. And this, for me, it's very important to understand the corpus of hadith as just a source for fiqh, but not fiqh. So we cannot go to hadith maktaba and take any hadith and we say this fiqh. We need to understand how this hadith fits in the body of all text. So in our modern times, still we witness some traditional writings by Indian scholars and by Muslim scholars in the Middle East. So this mostly to analyze, comment, judge varied viewpoints on hadith matters. For the impact of Orientalism, 5 points. Notice the first one: the authority of the Sunnah, refuting Orientalist and modern Arabs' criticism against Sunnah, the moral status of Prophet's companions, claiming the practice of Matan criticism by early and late hadith authorities, the emergence of term manhaj. And I would add manhaj al-naqd, as Dr. Shukri suggested. Manhaj and manhaj al-naqd, both, because sometimes you'll see just manhaj, al-manhaj al-muqtarah, and sometimes manhaj al-naqd. So for Salafi writings, we have 2 types of Salafi writings. So for me, there are 4 Salafis in our time. So Salafi Islahi, Salafi Manhaji, and Salafi Da'awi or Haraki, and Salafi, I forgot the 4th one, because I wrote an essay about the rise of Salafism during the Syrian war, and I just divided all of these in 4 categories. So for Salafiyya Islahiyya or reforming Salafi, reviving Salafi, this mostly collecting opinions in order to raise Muslim awareness towards the most authoritative religious texts, Quran and Sunnah. We see this viewpoint in 2 books. The first one, قواعد التحديث by Jamal al-Din al-Qasimi, and the second one by Sheikh Tahir al-Jazairi, توجيه النظر. And the second Salafi, Salafiyya Manhajiyya, I avoid to translate Manhajiyya because some just put traditional, but that's very weird to put traditional with Salafism. And Manhajiyya here, how it's, so all translation I'm not satisfied, just I leave to you. So Al-Albani, there are some fatawas collected by his student called Al-Fatawa Al-Manhajiyya, and this is not connected with fiqh. Fatawa al-Manhajiyya based on how we approach the idea of Salafism, the definition of Salafism, the characteristics of Salafism, and everything. So Salafiyya al-Manhajiyya, mostly they produce some theoretical works, editing books, Sheikh Shuaib al-Arnaoud, Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Arnaoud, Sheikh Nasir al-Din al-Albani, and doing takhrij. On theoretical works, there are many works, one of them by Sharif al-Auni and Hamza Milyabari, and the dividing between متقدمين and متأخرين, and the real people of أهل الاصطلاح are متقدمين, so we cannot rely on متأخرين. And this for me is to ruin the idea of ilm and to the concept, because going to متقدمين, this jump from معاصرين to متقدمين, this is a very big jump, and I don't see any production with this, with the definitions and application. Okay, that's good. So summary. So I have 6 points to summarize everything. So then Al-Shafi'i was the founder of the science of authentication. Then with Al-Hakim work, who created the types of anwa', genre that had been developed gradually later, the science of hadith terminology established. Later on, hadith terminology developed through the legal theory and legal definitions by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, and in particular Ibn Muṣṭalaḥ. With Ibn Hajar, terms, definitions established and crystallized, and finally in the contemporary era, hadith criticism had been studied under manhaj title. So now qawaid and or mustalah, and then manhaj. And this mostly the characteristic of our modern time. We see that in tafsir and we see that in hadith. Mostly in our time, many Arab scholars engage in the idea of coherence of Quran. Nazm is not to tafsir ayah verse by verse. The idea of manhaj is how to approach Quran as one piece. And also here, manhaj is to understand ilm al-hadith, how we can give or to map out all of these istilah under main, like six main categories, 3 main categories, or 2 main categories like this. And then the binary division of sahih, da'if, or accepted, rejected became 3 division. So sahih, hasan, da'if, and then 5. صحيح لذاته, صحيح لغيره, حسن لذاته, حسن لغيره, and ضعيف. The concept of sahih as established by Shafi'i continued to be accepted without any major modifications. So from the 2nd Islamic century till now, the definition of sahih, we don't have any change. But in each chart, we have a lot of works. So the meaning of ittisal, we cannot reach the meaning of ittisal without understanding who and when and where. So to understand the idea of ittisal, we need to read that in the 2nd Islamic century. What's the meaning of ittisal in the 2nd Islamic century? We have a debate on mursal and muttasil and the meaning of mursal. And then we go to the 3rd Islamic century. We have another debate, and 4th Islamic century. And same for adala, same for dabat. So these all 5 conditions are a very important area for study. In each century and with each scholar, and then the context, all of these said and written. The 4th point, the definition of shadh, which was established by Shafi'i, was dominant in the very late works from Ibn Hajar onward. However, the change applied to the definition by Al-Hakim and Al-Khalili was a special development that is based on the temporal context. The definition of Hasan underwent a very long process of defining from its usage in the 3rd Islamic century till the clear definition in the 9th Islamic century by Ibn Hajar. Finally, the 8 ranks of transmitters made by Ibn Abi Hatim became 12 with Ibn Hajar. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So we have just 5 questions, 5 minutes for questions. Yes.
On this issue of shadh and this, it's changed from just tafarrud and mukhalafah to tafarrud later on. I think it's also significant. It's important to look at the early Hanafi works, because, like, if I'm not mistaken, in Red al-Asir al-Awza'i, Abu Yusuf talks about shadh.
Yeah, right.
And he doesn't have mukhalafah. He just considers tafarrud in itself to be a problem.
Qara'ib.
Right. Just tafarrud itself to be
because he warned against Qara'ib, and the same under Qara'ib but shadh. Yeah. You are right. Right.
So I think that's important because Imam Shafi transmits that work from the beginning until the end in Kitab al-Ulum and comments on it. And so there, it seems as if, it's possible that Imam Shafi is aware of that approach, which considers just tafarrud to be shadh, and is trying to change that.
But do you think that Abu Yusuf here introduced shadh as a technical term, or just like to speak about a general image of shuzuz in his time as a technical term? Because here we can see in a Shafi just as a technical term. But the idea of shuzuz also, there is a very general meaning of shuzuz and illah and all of these, ittisal, adala, and dabat. So do you see this as a technical term or just a general meaning?
I think he approaches it from the perspective of usul.
Yeah.
saying, you know, these garaib and tafarrudat, you can't base amal upon these. So I think he's approaching it.
You said amal, right?
Yeah.
As that's very clear, because we read in Jassas, shuzuz just connected with amal. It's not about nazar. So when we say shaz, that this hadith we cannot rely in amal, but this is different from muhaddis viewpoint. So for muhaddis viewpoint, is not about amal, it's about just hadith narrated by thiqa, but then it seems that weaker than another hadith coming from sound or reliable narrator. Yeah, thank you. Any question from the webcast? Any final question, because we are very limited with time. So 8:10. Yes.
You mentioned the two different approaches of the mutaqaddimun and the mutaakhirun towards the knowledge of the hidden defect.
Yeah, right. Illa.
Al-illa. So ad-Daraqutni, where does he stand? Is he in the mutaqaddimin, or is his approach more?
That's a very important question. So the question by Maulana Abdul Rahman, he said, so based on mutaqaddimin and mutaakhirin, on the concept of illa, so where ad-Daraqutni should be mentioned, or I don't have any knowledge about this, and I need, so just as a general answer to say that Daraqutni in the extended century of mutaqaddimin. So based on this, if the extended century, that means illa for him zahir and batin, or clear and hidden illa, but we cannot reach in this way. So when he wrote on ilal and reduced ilal, we need to trace the meaning of illa in his works. If anyone knows about Daraqutni work, I think would be good. Do you know anything? Any? Yeah, yeah. Just if we found one hadith, like to consider illa under nasakh or kadhib, that's from mutaqaddimin. If we find one hadith. If we don't find this, that means illa based on the definition of mutaakhirin. And alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. However, all questions, and I'm sorry, I want to say that I'm sorry to delay and to be late with responding to messages. The last 2 weeks very hectic and busy, so I hope to respond to all of these emails very soon, inshallah. Thank you for generosity, and you are very patient with my non-native language, and hope this class is beneficial for me and you, inshallah. And there is a few words I've told to, yes, please.
Well, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. So inshallah, on behalf of myself and Darul Qasim, would like to thank Sheikh Issam, and alhamdulillah, he took time and came from Vanderbilt University from Tennessee, and participated with us in the summer program. For him, it was basically 4 intensive weeks. And for those who do not know, so mashallah, for our advanced students, in the mornings in Arabic, he was teaching Shama'ilul Muhammadiyah of Imam Tirmidhi. And in the afternoon, he was teaching Sahih al-Bukhari, and also for Usul Fiqh, Usul al-Jassas. And in English, he was teaching every Tuesday an introduction to the Islamic studies in the West. Quranic studies. Thank you. And Thursday, which is our class, It's about Hadith terminology. That's also in English. And also, mashallah, he had the time to also go to our local masjid here, at least to MSI, where he talks about education in the West for Muslim, especially Muslim children. And alhamdulillah, what I would like to highlight, mashallah, this is a case where somebody who is conversant, who can speak to the Western academia, because he's, you know, that's from where he, alhamdulillah, he was teaching here at University of Chicago, and as I mentioned, in Vanderbilt. But also, mashallah, he's somebody who is not only engaged the tradition, but he's part of the tradition. So, and that's something that we really need, and inshallah, we encourage, and that's one reason why we would like him, inshallah, to see him more often at Darul Qasim, at least during the summers, inshallah. And also, of course, the tradition, and this is a little bit specific, mashallah, he represents especially the Shami tradition, the Syrian tradition. So, alhamdulillah, now through Darul Qasim, there is, mashallah, the barakah of the Shami Asanid also. So, alhamdulillah, so that's an honor for all of us, including myself. And I think, mashallah, and I thank him personally for that. And inshallah, thank you again. And I would just like to say it again that at Darul Qasim, part of what we would like to do is to have a dialogue between academia and our erudite tradition, but we have to do it ourselves first before we engage them. And inshallah, welcome once again, and barakallahu fik.
Jazakumullahu khairan. And thank you again for your patience and generosity. It's a very important time for me to be here, and some classes are everything here is mashallah beneficial and useful. Some classes like Jassas, as I said in the beginning, al-ilm based on mudarasa and muzakara. So you can read a book just by yourself, and then maybe you can build 2 statements or write 2 statements, 3 statements. But by mudarasa, the barakah of mudarasa, and this is the traditional way, is ilm is not about reading books, is not about suhafi or mushafi. It's about to sit and to struggle. And as I studied from my shuyukh in Sham, so samtu shaykh better than reading book. Like going to a shaykh and to be silent better than reading book with yourself. First, I didn't agree with this, and I struggled with this a lot. How? And I don't have time to do that. Like to go 1 hour walking maybe to the mountain of Qasyun and to sit with a sheikh, and then he just reading and he's silent without any commenting. But then I found that's very, very important, because wisdom is not about talking, it's about the virtue of silence more than talking. But how to be silent is not about to be silent without wisdom. And in the end, I read that ilm based on 2 major foundations. The first one, طلبنا العلم لغير الله فأبى أن يكون إلا لله. We seek knowledge for something just like for our personal benefit, and then in the end we read that everything connected and belong to Allah. And the second one is a very lovely hikmah. من يعلم كثيرا يغفر كثيرا. Whoever knows a lot forgives a lot. Because if you are in the beginning of talab, you see everything yaqeen. This is what you, and then no, that's wrong, and that's right. But after studying, no, it's like every single mas'ala needs a lot of works. And if you don't come to each single mas'ala without a new question, so that's yani poverty in knowledge. So each question in each moment is a new question. If you receive any question or the same question from a different person, and you say you have same answer, so that's not knowledge. And here we can understand why the Prophet ﷺ gave different answers, because he is da'imul fikra, and dawam al-fikra to give different answers. But if you don't have dawam al-fikra, and you don't have the struggling with yourself about ilm, no, this is not tahqiq, and I need to go deeply. So I don't want to take long. Alhamdulillah, and thank you again, and see you inshallah in the future. Assalamu alaikum.